Hello and welcome to the Read to Know podcast, where the goal is to actually remember what you read. On this podcast, we go through a book one chapter at a time, and each week we actually practice remembering what we've read. So we don't just remember, but then we can actually better apply it to our life. If you want to follow along, we're currently working our way through Stephen Covey's book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. This week, we'll be looking at Habit 4, which is Think, Win, Win. And then next week, we'll be looking at Habit 5, Seek first to understand, then to be understood. I'm Zach Brown, and my friend Chris Yarber is joining me to help discuss and break down this book. Also, if you've been listening and following along up to this point, we're super stoked that you're here, and we'd love to hear from you. So please reach out and say hello. We are at Read to Know Pod on all platforms. Also, if you listen on Apple Podcasts, please leave a rating and a review. It would help us a ton. And if you don't have Apple Podcasts, no worries. Just share this with a friend who might be interested. Anyway, thanks again for listening and enjoy the conversation. Chris,
Yes.
this has now become my new favorite sparkling water flavor. And it's not LaCroix. It is a brand called Aha. I think that's how you say it.
Yeah.
And I think it's actually made by Coke. It's a Coke product. So
Yes.
hopefully it's not bad for you, but
Yes.
But this flavor is black cherry and coffee, and I think it's amazing.
Yes. When you first introduced me to that, I was quite intrigued to taste what black coffee and cherry tasted like together. But it being one of the first sparkling waters from Aha I ever have had, which you've introduced me to a lot of LaCroix and other ones as well. But it's primarily what's been in my mug here ever since we've been doing this podcast.
Yeah. Although we have tried a lot. We've probably had a different flavor of LaCroix or Aha, some kind of sparkling water in our cups each episode. We've probably had a different one each episode.
Yeah, and I love Diet Coke as well. I like regular Coke, but I like Diet Coke as well. So if I don't have sparkling water, I probably have Diet Coke. Got to get my aspartame.
Yeah.
So anyway,
Yeah.
We're in today Habit 4. Congratulations on episode 7 of
Yes.
the podcast, which we said episode 7 of 7 highly effective habits, and we've arrived at Habit 4, which is
Which is Think, Win, Win. So now we're halfway through this book, basically. We are now into the relational aspect of these habits. We've moved from private victory to public victories, and this is the first habit in the public victory section, which is Habit 4, Think, Win, Win. And so basically, he starts out this chapter with a story where he's talking to a business owner, and he's like, man, I can't get my employees motivated. I can't get them focused. They're fighting against each other. They're not cooperating with each other, and you can't get anything done in a reasonable amount of time or effort, or all of those things. And so when they sit there and take a look at the problem, Stephen Covey's talking to him, and he's like, are you creating, a win-win environment for you and your employees and stuff? He's like, yeah, I'm encouraging them. I'm telling them, we got to work together. It's going to be better if you work together. And then he goes and looks at up on the board, I think in the employer's office.
yes, behind the door.
Yeah, there was a board that was a competition for a trip to like Bermuda.
Yes, it had all the employees and a roadmap leading to the Bermuda or the Bahamas, wherever they were going.
Yeah.
And he was pretty much turning it into a competition.
Yeah.
He was saying, yes, we've created a win-win environment. Yes, we're doing these relational things that Stephen Covey, looked at. And I just have to say, through all of his personal examples, he gives a lot in this chapter and in the previous chapters we've read. He'll mention these business illustrations that he's done before, and he'll talk about a situation, and I'll go, well, what's wrong with that? And then he points out, using the habit in that chapter, what's wrong with that point, which is quite amazing, him and his infinite wisdom to understand that.
That's actually so true. A lot of these stories and examples, before you hear the actual point that he's trying to make and you just listen to the story, you're like, okay, yeah, he's setting up a competition, something to motivate people. But it's actually this specific thing that he's trying to use to motivate people is actually demotivating them in a sense, because it is not endorsing cooperation as a team. It's not endorsing a high level of commitment to each other, a high level of relationship to each other. It's very one-sided. It's you're fighting for one thing, and that if you're not the one who wins, then you're the one who loses.
Right. This executive, this manager, this leader, or whatever his position may be, he starts off in this story saying that his team will not cooperate with one another. They just will not work with one another. And then we learn the reason why is because they're not coming into it with a win-win mentality, as we'll talk about with this habit, but really they're coming in with a mentality of, I want to win and I want you to lose, because if you're winning, that means that I'm losing.
Yep.
And that's a mentality which does not create cooperation within their business whatsoever.
Yep, and that's the epitome here of what he's talking about when he talks about think, win, win. And he says it later on in the chapter, like kind of later in the chapter. He says that usually when you're having trouble in that situation coming up with a win-win solution, or you're just having trouble cooperating with your employers or people you're working with, anything like that, usually the problem is actually not the people. And that's what a lot of times employers or family members or whoever you're in a relationship with, they think the person is the problem, when it's actually not the person, but it's the environment or the systems that are in place that create that tension, and they create that that friction.
Yes.
And it's actually, if you change the environment, you switch the paradigms involved in that environment, that you can actually change the outcome.
Right. Which is why in this chapter, Think Win Win, he goes over 6 paradigms for human interaction. And of course, the first one that he talks about is win-win, which this habit and this paradigm, what this paradigm is saying is that there's enough space for everyone to have a win here. You don't have to walk away from this situation or the solution feeling as if you've lost.
Yeah.
But in fact, I can win and you can win. But as you said, it's about getting those processes and systems in place to where you can make that happen.
Right.
And also what helps create a win-win environment is understanding the other 5 interactions as well.
Yeah.
Because not until he breaks down those other 5 interactions that I noticed how much in my personal relationships and in business as well, a lot of my mentality is the win-lose, which is that second interaction that he goes into.
Yeah, exactly. And so to list all these out, just to go ahead and list them, we have win-win, then we have win-lose, then we have lose-win, and then we have lose-lose, then just win, and then win-win or no deal.
Yeah.
So those are the 6. And, a lot of that is kind of almost self-explanatory, but digging into them a little deeper, we all, can, in a relationship, can go from a place of negotiating in any of those paradigms.
Right.
But we may have a preference, we may prefer win-lose just because we want to win, we don't want to lose, and no matter what, we're gonna try and win. And what's funny, the interesting thing about that one in particular, is that one is, as he mentions, is a lot of times ingrained into our psyche from a very early age, even from our childhood.
Yeah.
If our parents have a favorite child, or something like that, then you're like, okay, I have to win. I have to basically beat out my other siblings to be the favorite. Or even he said competition in sports. Obviously that's a win-lose situation.
Right.
You either win or you lose, and you want to be the one who wins. You're fighting to win.
Yeah.
And so that kind of win-lose mentality actually can be ingrained in a lot of our psyches from a very early age.
Yeah, and so another way that this is kind of ingrained, not only with sports and different things like that, but also with schooling as well, because as objective as teachers want to be, sometimes our grading is based off of other students.
Right.
And so, and again, that competition aspect is there to do better than other people. I must win and look good.
Right.
And if I win and look good, then other people lose and they look bad.
Right.
Whether that means they get a bad grade or they lose the game or something like that.
Right. And it's a competition in and of itself versus, student versus student, basically. Yes. And it has no consideration as to what Stephen Covey says. It actually has no consideration as to that person's actual commitment level, or that student's actual effort put in, or what their ability is. Because everyone's different in school. Not everyone is going to walk into the same class and be able to perform at the same level. That doesn't mean that they're not smart. It's just that everyone has a different level of performance.
Right.
But yeah, so then the next section is actually what is lose win.
Mm-hmm.
And basically this person comes from a place of in a relationship that they're always losing so that the other person can win. They default to letting someone else win and letting themselves lose, either out of a few reasons, either an insecurity or wanting to be liked, or just maybe even a set mindset of I don't deserve to win, or everyone I just let people do whatever they want, or that that kind of thing, and they don't even try and win themselves. They just default to losing.
Right. And no matter what the purpose behind it may be, this really has become a habit for that person.
Yeah.
They don't think to themselves, I'm losing and this person's winning and I'm letting that happen.
Right.
They don't think that way. And this is why I love how he entitles this habit for think, win, win, because that's the habit, is thinking win-win.
Right.
It's not the doing that comes before the thinking, and so he wants to get us in that mindset so that we actually carry this out in our relationships, no matter where those relationships may be. And so that person who is thinking and doing lose-win, they don't think about it in these terms. And you and I have made jokes after reading this chapter of how, hey, is this a win-win situation for us? Because you just don't hear that kind of language, and no one thinks that way. But these are the habits that a lot of us are stuck in, and probably can easily identify, and this is healthy for us to identify what category or interaction we find ourselves in.
Right, yep. And the next one, which I find is kind of funny, we joked about this too, is the lose-lose situation.
Yes.
And in the chapter, Stephen Covey gives the example of a couple that was going through a divorce.
Yes.
And in court, they needed half of, like they were splitting up their possessions, and anything that the wife had was splitting with him, the husband actually sold, and then for a ridiculously low amount, just to spite her.
Right.
And even he said, I think a $50,000 Corvette he sold for like $50 and gave her $25.
Right. Gave her $25. Right. Just for her to lose. And he calls this lose-lose the philosophy of war.
Yeah.
In other words, if you're not going to win, then I'm not going to win. Nobody's going to win. And I'll take my losses, but I'm sure I'm going to make sure that you lose yourself. Yep. So he really calls it the philosophy of war.
And what a pitiful mindset.
I know.
Just to be like, if I can't win, then no one is.
Right.
And
so
force everyone to lose.
Right.
Really, that one's an obvious, not a good choice.
No, right. And the fifth one.
But sometimes we still do it. That's
right.
the thing.
We certainly do. And again,
in
we don't,
small ways.
We don't think in those terms. Right. We're not going and selling a $50,000 Corvette or whatever for $50, but we certainly
it's on a smaller scale than that
when
we do it in our lives, but it still happens from time to time.
Yeah, and it can be just as detrimental to the lose-lose situation is very detrimental to emotional bank accounts as well. And lose-lose is quite opposite of this fifth interaction, which is just win. And I saw that and I was like, okay, yeah, win sounds pretty good.
Right.
But really, when he since it's just one win, it's not win-win. It's just win, as in you win. It doesn't matter if the other person loses or not, or what. You don't even really care about the other person, because that's why it's not entitled win-lose or one of the others. It's just win. You're only concerned about yourself.
Yeah. And so it's basically, like you said, you actually have no concern whether the other person wins or loses. It doesn't matter. It's not even on your radar, actually.
No.
So you're not even worried about that. You're just trying to win.
Right.
And then the last one was win-win or no deal, which at first I think we both thought was actually a negative thing.
Yeah.
But he actually flips it around and he says that win-win or no deal can actually be a positive and freeing thing.
Yes, and I like how I believe it's in that section, which we'll open up in the second half of this podcast when we get into the book and naming quotes and stuff. But he says, you got to keep this in mind. This mindset is great as we move from dependence to interdependence, from private victories to public victories. This is a great thing to think, but not all of life is a competition and set up to where it's going to work out perfect. And he actually, before he gets into the win-win or no deal, he actually says, you've read these 5 and you think to yourself, okay, which one is best? We would assume win-win because that's the name of the habit. But at the same time, you kind of have to judge it based off of the situation.
Right.
And not everything is going to call for a particular interaction.
Yeah.
But for the most part, we want to strike with win-win, a mutual benefit for both parties. And then also at the same time, if we can't have win-win clearly, then let's just say no deal, which isn't always practical in the business sense or in the business world, of course, talking about contracts and stuff. But win-win or no deal certainly was a positive thing.
Which I like that kind of way he approaches all these paradigms because when you think about it, you can't have win-win scenarios every single time and in every single relationship all the time in life. That's just not how it's going to work. Right. And he doesn't say avoid the rest of those, although he probably would say avoid lose-lose.
Yes.
Don't do that one.
Right.
But the rest of them, there are times to have a win-lose. There are times to have lose-win. Mm-hmm. There are times to have win-win or no deal.
Yeah.
And there's times to have win-win. But obviously our goal is to be win-win as much as possible. Mm-hmm. And that's why, like you said, he's saying think win-win. Right. That's your goal. But sometimes it makes sense to lose-win. And he gives the example here. He gives the example that, maybe it's like you're in a relationship and you're making a decision and it's just a kind of an insignificant decision. There's no you don't have to put your foot down and die on that hill. You know what I mean? And it's just like, yeah, I can give in on this one. It's not that big a deal. And then he says a lower form of win-win, which is compromise, which is huge in relationships as well.
Right.
And so I like how these different paradigms, they have negative consequences. The win-lose, the lose-win, those have negative consequences, as he mentions, either being like for lose-win would be, later resentment, right? Mm-hmm. Because you're not winning. And so you may still be in a relationship with that person or that business or that employee, but you're not happy about the results. So you start to form some kind of resentment towards that person.
Right.
Win-lose, where you think you're winning, but long-term that person who's losing is going to have the same feeling towards you. They're going to resent you. And, so there are negatives to some of these, but they can also work in a positive way if you default to them appropriately.
Yes. There was a story that I thought of as you were rehearsing that before we move into the next section of the book or this chapter, which was there was a story he told which was really a lose-win situation. Mm-hmm. And so there was a computer company, or not a computer company, but some kind of digital company that worked with some of the computer operations at a bank.
Yes, like a technology company making software for a bank.
Yes, software. That's the word I was looking for. Yeah, software. So they created software for this bank, and this president who was at the bank was really excited about it. Everyone else at the company was not really on board with it, not really too happy about it, but the president was really pushing it. And so he signed a contract with this software company. He signed a contract, and it was for a certain amount of years, for a certain amount of money. I think it was like $75,000 or something like that.
Right.
And he left a month to a couple months after that. Mm-hmm. And then a new president came in. Well, I'm sure the people who were not too thrilled about the new software spoke to the new president and said, we're not too thrilled about this software, but they signed, the bank signed a contract. Is there anything that can be done?
Right. They let him know. Yeah.
Yeah. And the president goes to that software company and speaks with them. And, the software company really could have shown some courage and said, well, I mean, you signed a contract, so you're going to have to pay this amount. Right. But instead of doing that, they took this approach to where they said, okay, well, you can have your deposit back. Don't worry about honoring the contract. You can have your deposit back. But if you ever need an update in software, come to us. Right. And so really that's them losing and the bank winning on that situation. Mm-hmm. But then later on in the bank's president's in his tenure, mm-hmm. he goes to that software company, and instead of signing a $75,000 contract, they signed a $250,000 contract.
Right.
So don't think just because not every situation is win-win, don't think mm-hmm. that you're failing in life or that you're not effective just because not every situation works out win-win.
Right.
This chapter, it's a little bit messier than that, and I think he does a good job of explaining that.
Right. Yeah, and exactly. And I think the way that to be able to work in those relationships and have some lose-win scenarios, especially, and not have, resentment issues or anything that crops up from those negative effects of a lose-win relationship, is you come from a place of thinking win-win first, and you have all of that in line to then where you can choose to do that in certain circumstances when you're in control and you know what you're doing.
Right.
And it's kind of just being mentally aware of those things, really, is what it comes down to.
Right.
And then, of course, that leads to the question of how do you even get to a win-win relationship and a win-win situation in the first place?
Yes.
And that's what the rest of this chapter is about.
Yes. So just to review before we go into the next section, the 6 paradigms of human interaction, we had win-win, which is the habit we want to get in thinking about. And then we have win-lose, lose-win, lose-lose, just win, and then we have win-win or no deal, and then we get into the next section of how to think win-win.
Right, and so basically the rest of the chapter boils down to what he calls the 5 dimensions of a win-win scenario. So there are 5 basically ingredients to then formulate a win-win relationship. And
he says dimensions, you say ingredients. I like ingredients a little bit more because, as I told you, which this is what's so fun about having someone to talk this out with, is I could come to you and I was like, I really don't understand this part, what he means by dimensions, because this is a complex book. I mean, he's a complex writer, so really ingredients, that's a good word.
Yeah, really, I think, a lot of this comes to life in just talking about it, for sure. So the ingredients, the first ingredient is character. And so the good thing about this ingredient is that with habits 1, 2, and 3 in place, our character is actually then formed from those habits. And that's what he talks about here. And so this foundation for character stems from the first 3 habits. Because he says, in a relationship or an agreement, how do you know what's a win for you? If you don't have principles and values that are guiding your life, that you can then attach to, what is going on in that relationship or situation. So you have to have those, and you have to know, and then you also have to just come from, like what he says, character. The 3 aspects of character is what he said: integrity.
Was the first one.
Yeah, and then is maturity, right? And then the last one was
ability of mentality.
It was
I forgot. Abundance of mentality?
Abundance mentality. That was it. Yep.
There we go.
Exactly. That's it. So abundance mentality. So the three components for character is integrity, maturity, and abundance mentality. And so basically integrity, right, it's just being truthful and being true, and not trying to take advantage of the situation or anything like that.
But treating everyone the same. Right. He kind of covered that in the chapter before this.
Maturity was an interesting part of this, though, because maturity, he says, it actually takes courage to actually think win-win.
Right.
More courage than win-lose or lose-win.
Right. And the thing about, I like how he uses that word courage, because it's not, having courage is different from being a jerk.
Yeah.
It's different from just being abrupt and in somebody's face about something, but being able to speak up for yourself and really not just walk away from a situation, especially in a business situation where, you may think to yourself after a conversation or after you strike up a deal that was a win-win situation, but then you look back at it and you're like, no, really, I kind of lost on that one.
Right.
And it's really because I was afraid to speak up.
Right.
And so courage is different from just being a jerk about things.
Yeah, exactly. And he says kind of the crux of maturity is that you have a maximum amount of compassion or just tuned into the wants and desires of the other person involved, and then also the maximum amount of basically bravery or courage to then talk about and share what you need for a win personally. So it's basically an equal amount of consideration for the other person, but then also the same amount of consideration for yourself, basically.
Right.
And that's what he's talking about with maturity, which is an interesting kind of table. He even has a table in that talks about basically like similar to the 4 quadrants that we talked about in habit 3 or habit 2 or 3. I'm getting them mixed up now.
One of those.
Yeah, but But he has another box with 4 squares, and think win-win is at the top, maximum consideration and maximum courage,
Right.
for you and then for the other person.
Right.
So then moving on to the third one, which is another important thing revolving around character, is the abundance mentality. And I think that's huge. I think that's one of the biggest things. It's kind of not, he doesn't spend a whole lot of time talking about it, but I think that's one of the biggest paradigm shifts to make in this chapter. And it's just really thinking with the abundance mentality of, just because the other person wins doesn't mean that you have to lose. And just because other people have success does not mean that there's no more success for you out there.
Right.
It's like it's like thinking only a certain amount of students can get A's. It's like thinking only a certain amount of people can, become a millionaire or whatever you want, what you're trying to get. Actually other people's success is a good thing for you. Yes. And there's not a it's the opposite of having a scarcity mentality.
Right.
And I think in America we used to be, I feel like I've mentioned this a lot. Just I keep going back to like the American dream. I feel like we used to live in an abundance mentality. That was the dream, right? There's enough for anyone to come in and they can make something of themselves and they can get what's theirs if they work for it.
Right.
And right now, the scarcity mentality is so prevalent, I think, in a lot of people, and it shows up in my life too. It shows up in everyone's life.
Right. Yeah, no, I love how he repeats these themes in this book, and he does it even with this first dimension. He starts off with character, which then moves to relationships. So it's inner working its way outward, which really takes us back to the very beginning.
Yeah.
And so relationships is that next key, but it starts with this most important shift, which is the thought, having the mentality behind it to make that shift into our relationships.
Right. So that's the first dimension, character.
Yeah.
Second dimension is then relationships. And he says basically relationships is the key. You know what I mean? If you're not worried about the relationship, then you're not gonna get to a win-win situation.
Right. This is a public victory. This is no longer private. It's not just about you anymore. We have other people to think about. It's not just a win, it's a win-win. So you have to have those other people in mind, and that's why it's the second dimension. But it flows out of our character.
Right.
When we have integrity and maturity, when we have compassion, and we have courage, and then when we also have the mindset of, hey, I can win and you can win too. There's plenty out there for everyone. Then we can begin to work on those relationships.
Right. And he ties this section into the previous chapter, talking about the emotional bank account.
Yes.
And really, we can't expect to come to a win-win situation very easily if our emotional bank account with that person is very low.
Right.
That's why it's important to then have a high emotional bank account with people.
Right.
And when you follow those steps to deposit into people's emotional bank account, that gives way to make it easier to move into a win-win relationship.
Right. And what you'll see with people who oftentimes have low emotional bank accounts is really that's when you enter into relationships that are all about either win-lose or lose-win. If it's dangerously low, it could be lose-lose as well, as we saw with that husband and that wife. I mean, that emotional bank account was wrecked.
Yeah.
So, that is a good connection between this chapter and the last.
Yep. So then that was dimension 2.
Yep.
Third dimension then is agreements.
Yes.
And so in the book, he has this kind of graph here, and the first 3, character, and then relationship and agreements, are like 3 triangles or pyramids, and then over underneath those, as kind of like the base, are then the last 2 dimensions.
Yes. It's really what supports those 3 and really makes those 3 things happen and carry out.
Yes.
Which that first line that was underneath those 3 pyramids is support systems, and then the 5th dimension was processes. Underneath that.
Yeah. So back to agreements.
Yes.
So agreements, the crucial thing about agreements is that it basically sets specific guidelines, and that's part of it. It makes everything clear. It's communicating with clarity between you and that other person, and doing that gets you both on the same page. Basically, is what it comes down to. And he has, I think it was 5 things that played into creating the right agreement. And I'm not sure if I'll remember all 5 of those, but we'll see here. And if you know any, chime in.
Chime in.
and I'm not sure the order here, but guidelines was one of them, right? So you have to have specific guidelines, parameters to play into. Resources was another one, and is basically what resources can that person take advantage of in the agreement? You know, what do they have to pull from to help them? Another one was consequences, where, you know, obviously if certain things didn't happen, what was, if the outcomes weren't made, what would be the consequences? I think the one of them, maybe the first one, was like, what's the outcome? Wasn't it? Basically, what's the outcome? What do you want at the end of the day? What is the thing that you want out of this agreement, relationship, this deal,
Right.
Anything like that. So that was 4 of them. I don't know if you remember the last one.
I do not. You said guidelines first, and that was one of the only ones I remembered. So congratulations on the 4, though. We'll crack open the book and see the 5th one, but
we'll figure out which one.
Congratulations. Yeah.
But all those things play into an agreement, and the thing I like about those in that list is that, and he gives the example, the agreement was what he came to with his son when he was talking about his son keeping the yard clean. He said clean and green. That was part of their agreement. They made an agreement, and he was in charge. His son was in charge of keeping the yard clean. That was a few chapters back when he had that story there.
Yeah.
And the thing about that story and that situation of agreements is it's really like a bullet point list. Like, say you're gonna have an agreement, you're gonna delegate something to someone, or you're hiring someone, or you're just in a relationship with someone, and you have something that is some kind of something between the relationship. You can literally just go through these points and be like, all right, okay, do we have guidelines set? Do we have consequences set? All those things, so that you're not missing anything.
Right.
He's basically telling you this is how to set it up. You know what I mean? If you need to delegate something off, if you want someone to join your team and be a part of the process, be a part of the goal, of the overall ambition of the team, of the company, or of the organization, all those things, that's the guideline to making the agreement, to setting up the agreement. Just going through those points, and basically, boom, you have an agreement.
Right. Which it's only when you have an agreement that the next part comes for the foundation, which is having the right systems in place to support and really continue on those agreements moving forward, having those right systems in place.
Yep. And this is where he gets into what I mentioned earlier, is that people aren't usually the problem. You know what I mean? It's the systems. And so the systems have to fit the win-win mentality.
Yes.
Just like at the example at the beginning, that story at the beginning, the guy had the trip to Bermuda where all the employees were fighting each other to win the trip to Bermuda, and it didn't promote a win-win environment.
Right.
And that was the problem. When they switched that around and they created a win-win environment, people were more than willing and quickly switch to a win-win interpersonal relationship with each other.
Right. The idea itself wasn't bad. It was just placed in the wrong context for them to cooperate with one another. A win-win situation would have been, just for example, he didn't say this, but a win-win situation would have been if we met this goal, whether it was to make a certain amount of money or sell a certain amount of product, then we all get to go to the Bermuda or to Bahamas, whatever, then that would be a win-win situation. And everyone, I'm sure, would have cooperated a lot better to make sure that they would have been able to go all together. Right.
And he even gave an example like that to another business, a different business, around that section of the chapter, where they had, I think it was 300 or 400 employees all gather for like a yearly conference, and they had rewards and things for the top 40, top 40 people in the company. So that left 360 people out. Basically, there were 40 winners, but it was not said explicitly, but basically there were 360 losers.
Yes.
Is what they were subconsciously saying.
Right.
And basically, they switched that around. They switched their process of rewarding people to a win-win mentality, to a, hey, we all win.
Right.
Right? And that just skyrocketed, their numbers. People, those individuals, literally produced the same as the top 40 people last year each. You know what I mean? Basically, they their numbers skyrocketed to each person because they were so much more committed and they were like, we're all winners in this situation.
Right.
So they have a reason to contribute even more.
Right. And as we learn from this illustration, it's not about changing the system altogether to create win-win, because more than likely, whether it is in your family or at a business or something like that, you already have a win-lose kind of mentality. It's just tweaking that system. It's just small adjustments to make it win-win. And it's really not that difficult when you get in the habit of thinking win-win.
Right. And so then that was that was systems.
Yep.
The last one is processes, which is very similar, but it's basically, again, it's just having, certain things in place that help you stay on track to a think win-win mentality, right? And, I think part of that comes into the win-win or no deal. You know what I mean? He talks about with that, if you especially like in a business relationship or something like, or an early business relationship, when you're just meeting with maybe a new client or a new customer or a new provider, like a development firm or whatever, you can go in there with the expectation of, okay, we don't have to make a deal here, right? If it's not win-win for both of us, then maybe we just pause and we can come back later and maybe figure this out later.
Give it a little bit of thought.
Yeah, you don't have to push for a win-lose or a lose-win if you can't make a win-win happen. Right. And he says basically doing that just gives you tremendous freedom and not having to worry about that, being stressed, basically. It just de-stresses you. And actually, to backtrack a little bit, that made me think, the funny thing about when he was talking about agreements is that when he made an agreement with his daughter about using the car. Do you remember this?
Yes, I do remember this, yes. And he supplied, like, he talked about things that he supplied.
He supplied the car, the gas, and
insurance, and she was to supply, was it letting him know where she was going to go? And
then she had chores that she had to do, and she had to do it without complaining or with a happy attitude, all that stuff, and without being told. And if she did all those things, he would provide the gas and the car and the insurance, and she would be able to use the car whenever she wants. And then I think also they had to maybe sometimes she would give her parents a ride if they needed it or something like that.
Boom. And you got a win-win situation with a teenager, as we know. Hard to get a win-win sometimes with a teenager, but a simple agreement.
So you set the guidelines, the results you wanted. You set the consequences, right? And you had everything laid out, the resources, which was the gas and the insurance and the car, and you laid all those things out. And so then everyone was on the same page. And if those things fell through, then you would know what would happen.
Yep.
And then if not, then everything would just run smoothly and you would be. And the funny thing about that is that he said, as a parent, even, it takes huge pressure off you. You don't have to micromanage. You don't have to worry about what she's doing. You know what I mean? And it just sets up a system in place that just basically runs automatically, and you don't have to worry about it.
Right. Yeah, pretty much.
And everything's predetermined. If something doesn't happen, if she doesn't do her chores, then you automatically know what happened. You don't have to worry about, what's the punishment or what's, you know what I mean?
Right.
You already know. The system's in place. The guidelines are set,
Right. So Yeah. No, it takes a lot of pressure off of you, and the same can be done in a business relationship as well.
Yeah. So processes and systems that's where that comes into play.
Yeah.
And, it makes a difference for keeping that sustainable win-win relationship going, basically.
Yeah. Well, I think the first half of this podcast was a win-win situation here. You did a great job covering this first half, but do you want to break it down and maybe go over some quotes that we enjoyed?
Yeah, I think I can't remember anything else after that, I don't think. Yeah. So he finishes up that chapter and basically just summarizes that again. Basically, it just comes down to, a win-win, it's possible, and it's more than possible. I think that was the last example that he gave was just a story where he was talking to another business owner, and he's like, this win-win thing, it's a great idea, but he said it seems too idealistic,
right,
and not very plausible.
Yes, that's right. And then he goes through questions with him, and he's asking, okay, are you winning or losing there? Are you winning and winning there? And you find out that it's not idealistic at all once you start to
And he says it's not idealistic. Win-win is not an idealistic outcome. It's actually the only realistic outcome, is what he says. And so I just like that mentality of thinking win-win and being like, really. We both in a friend relationship, in a marriage, in a business relationship, in a family relationship, we can walk into it and we can think win-win, and we can be like, I can benefit and you can benefit. We can equally benefit.
Right.
And it's actually going to be more positive than if I win and you lose, or if I lose and you win.
Right.
It's going to be majorly beneficial for each of us long term, and not just short term.
Right.
Yeah. So win-win, powerful stuff.
Yep.
All right, let's break out the book. You know, as we open up our books and I'm flipping through the pages here, I realize that story that we just ended the chapter with was actually not at the end of the chapter. It was pretty early on in the chapter.
But
you know, that's part of remembering. Sometimes you remember things out of order, but the important thing is you remembered it.
You remembered, right. The order is not always important. You know, this book has a lot of lists, so trying to remember, I mean, we kind of do that for the sake of the podcast itself, kind of trying to remember the whole list and stuff like that, but the best thing is to remember those most important things and to review those most important things, which we're going to do.
Right. It's a mental challenge, and that's why we're doing it, because it's, you know, it's supposed to challenge you, and that's the important thing about it. So.
Right. But on my half, when you ended with that story, I said, yeah, that was the end of the story. That's great, man. In my mind, I was thinking, I'm so proud of you for remembering that as the end. That's awesome. And it wasn't until we opened up the book we went, oh, dang.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yep. So anyway, that story of, you know, as he says, they considered their various options in that business, or, you know, their alternatives. Win-win was the only truly realistic approach to that situation.
Yes.
But anyway, back to the very beginning of this chapter. And I just want to go through, touch on things that we might have missed, things we didn't quite cover as well, and then also just go through and point out favorite quotes, things that we like, that he said specifically about certain things. So we might not cover everything in detail, but we're just going to give you some bullet points of things that we missed, and then also just favorite quotes that we liked.
Right.
So probably the first thing here is that basically, to sum up win-win, it's not a technique, is what he says. It's actually a total philosophy of human interaction.
Right.
And so that's another, I think, important thing to think about when dealing with win-win, is that it's not like a social technique. It's not a social trick, right? You know what I mean? Because you've seen those YouTube videos or books and things like that are like, here's this one social trick. You know what I mean? To have the best negotiating skills, or you know what I mean? Things like that. And that's not what this is. Right. It's not some technique.
Right. Well, and those social techniques, again, that's all about you getting your way. Right. And win-win is not about you getting your way. No, it's coming to a mutual decision and win for both of us. And so it's not a technique, because you don't have that objective behind it.
Yep. The difference between those is that it's a frame of mind. Win-win is a frame of mind and heart. Not just mind and heart, that constantly seeks mutual benefit in all human interactions. And so that's basically the foundation. You can think win-win in any human interaction. You know what I mean? It comes down to that. It's not just deals or negotiations or, you know, or contracts being signed, that type of thing. But it's just in dealing with people on a daily basis.
Yeah.
And so, you know, win-win, again, it's based on the abundance mentality, that it's on the paradigm that there's plenty for everybody, that one person's success is not achieved at the expense or exclusion of the success of others.
Right. Yeah, it's not your way, it's not my way, it's a higher way. It goes above selfishness. It really goes above both of those for the benefit of both.
Right. And so moving on then to win-lose, the win-lose section. The one of the most striking things to me when I was reading this was when they were talking about the school example, right? We're talking about grades. You know what I mean? Your daughter's doing really well. She is getting like all A's. Oh no, but Johnny, he's getting C's and D's. Oh no, that's terrible. What can we do about it? And he says here, which is interesting because I don't think we think about this a lot, but people are not graded against their potential or against the full use of their present capacity.
Yeah.
They are graded in relation to other people. And grades are carriers of social value. They open doors of opportunity or they close them. Competition, not cooperation, lies at the core of the educational process. Cooperation, in fact, is usually associated with cheating.
Yes.
So the school system and the way we grow up, like we said, it's ingrained in us for a win-lose mentality from the get-go.
Right.
And that could be from our parents. That could be from athletic things. That could be with sports, and that can be with our schooling, I find that funny. Basically, school is a competition to get better grades than the other students, but cooperation is basically cheating.
Yes, yeah.
Which is funny because it's not how life works. Life works in cooperation with others, not competition most of the time.
Right. And he says here about that competition aspects, he says towards the end of that section that most of life is not a competition, that there is a place for win-lose situations, because again, you may not always be presented with a win-win opportunity. Right. However, most of life is not a competition.
Right.
And so the win-lose most of the time is not needed.
Right. And of course, we're not saying sports or something like that is a bad thing.
No.
There are times that's the perfect opportunity for a win-lose situation. Obviously, one team has to win and one team has to lose.
Right.
You can't.
And that's
you
in
can't
the
go out
context
with two winners.
That's in the context of sports, not in the context of relationships. Because he says somewhere in this chapter that when it comes to marriage, for example, win-lose, that's not a good situation, because when one is losing, both are losing.
Right.
And when one is winning, really both can have that win-win opportunity. And so that's in the context of sports, not in the context of relationships.
Right. It's kind of that organizational situation setting though, like different organizations working, really competing against each other. But how terrible would that be if sports was a win-win scenario?
Awful.
It would be so boring and no one would watch.
I would not be wearing this shirt right now, whichever side it's on. There it is.
Right.
I wouldn't be wearing it. Yeah.
So he basically, there is a place for win-lose thinking in truly competitive and low-trust situations, but most of life is not a competition, like he said. Yeah. So moving on to lose-win. And I think the most interesting part in this section is, and he says in a leadership style, what lose-win is permissiveness or indulgence. And that's even, again, in a leadership in an organization or leadership as in parents, that type of thing. They seek strength from popularity or acceptance, right? And I think he says many executives, managers, and parents swing back and forth on a pendulum from win-lose to then lose-win. And they go back from, being, they stand when they can't stand confusion or lack of structure, direction, expectation, and discipline, then they swing back to win-lose until guilt undermines their resolve and drives them back to lose-win, where they become permissive and indulgent again, until anger and frustration drive them back to win-lose again. And so it's just a cycle back and forth between the two.
Right.
So basically when you don't have that balance, it's a little chaotic. When you don't have the win-win, that you can't find the balance between win-lose and lose-win.
Right. Well, he even says that both of these, the win-lose and lose-win, are weak positions and based in personal insecurities. So you just really don't end up moving anywhere, because if you're swinging back and forth, you're not going forward in the relationship. You're just moving back and forth. Right. You're moving, and so you may sense as if the relationship is cohesive and working out, but really it may not be as strong as you may think it is.
Right. Yep. And so then moving on to lose-lose, obviously the big example there was the husband and wife who were getting a divorce, and him selling the $50,000 car for $50.
Yes.
And he says at the end here, lose-lose is also the philosophy of highly dependent of the highly dependent person without inner direction, who is miserable and thinks everyone else should be too.
Yep.
And like I said, just a pitiful mentality to live by, and not beneficial in the slightest.
Right.
So he says which option is the best out of all these? It depends, right? It depends on the situation. He says if you value the relationship and the issue, and the issue isn't really important, you may want to go for the lose-win, right? In some circumstances, to genuinely affirm that other person. But you have to intentionally choose that, right? It's a conclusion that you come to on your own, that you want to, just say maybe it's not worth it. It's worth it that they just win this one, and it's not that big of a deal, really.
Right. Yeah, and he even says the best choice then, it depends on reality. It depends on the reality of the situation. He says that the challenge is to read that reality accurately and not to translate win, lose, or other scriptings into every situation. Right. So learning to read it, and that's why he gives so many personal examples in this chapter, is it's all about reading the situation and understanding the reality.
Right. Yep. But then long-term win-lose or long-term lose-win is not a good idea, because he says my short-term win will really be a long-term lose if I don't get your repeat business, saying in a business relationship or something like that. So an interdependent win-lose is really just a lose-lose in the long run.
Yeah.
And then in the long run, basically, if I don't focus on my own win and don't even consider your point of view, there's no basis for any kind of productive relationship anyway. So in the long run, if it isn't a win for both of us, then we both lose. Mm-hmm. That's why win-win is the only real alternative in an independent reality.
Right.
So moving on then to win-win or no deal. Mm-hmm. And the biggest thing that I want to point out in this section is when you have no deal as an option in your mind, you feel liberated because you have no need to manipulate people, to push your own agenda, to drive for what you want. You can be open. You can really try to understand the deeper issues underlying the positions. And that's really, talking about the relational aspect of think win-win. That's really the goal, right? Is just to understand people's deeper underlying issues, connect with that person, understand what they want just as much as understanding what you want, and communicating that in a way that's effective. And no deal, having the no deal option can just be a freeing and a reality to then move into a communication with that person on working something out.
Right. It's if there isn't a win-win situation, it's a great deal to have the no deal, maybe to come back later and to resolve. But after that section, he goes back and says that anything less than a win-win is an interdependent reality, is a poor second best that will have impact in a long-term relationship. So he kind of he doesn't conclude with that right before he gets into the 5 dimensions of win-win, but he draws us back to that reminder, the importance of win-win concerning long-term relationships.
Exactly, yeah. And I tell you what, going through those, like the whole time I was reading these, I know just different relationships and things were just flashing, through my head. I'm like, was that lose-win? Is that win-lose? Is that actually win-win or win-win? No, So it's very interesting. I'm sure, probably anyone reading through this, they have ideas flashing through that, and even ideas like, how can I turn maybe a relationship that is kind of win-lose, or this thing that is win-lose or lose-win, and turn it into a win-win now, and that's these 5 dimensions is the guideline to turning those into a win-win reality, an actual interdependent reality. So moving on then, talking about the 5 dimensions of win-win. Think win-win is the habit of interpersonal leadership. It involves the exercise of each of the unique human endowments: self-awareness, imagination, conscience, and independent will, which we've talked about earlier in earlier chapters. And he says, this takes great courage as well as consideration to create these mutual benefits, particularly if we're interacting with others who are deeply scripted in win-lose. So it really is tough working out of a win-lose or lose-win situation, especially if that other person is at win-lose and they are focused on winning and just so that they don't have to lose.
Right. And the getting into this diagram of how these 5 dimensions relate to each other, you said this, but I think it's just important to review that we have these 3 pyramids of character, relationships, and agreements. And then underneath that, we have support systems and process. And the first one is character, which we have 3 webs coming down from that. And you said these, but integrity, maturity, and abundance mentality.
Right. And I think, basically we cover these pretty well from what I'm seeing. Integrity, habits 1, 2, and 3 is what helps us develop and maintain that, right? And there's no way to know what a win is in our own lives if we don't know in a deep sense what constitutes a win and what's harmonious with our innermost values, is what he says.
Right.
Maturity is the balance between courage and consideration. And he has that chart again where high consideration and high courage equals win-win.
Yep. And just like you said, for abundance mentality, in other words, knowing and understanding that there's plenty out there for everyone, which the abundance mentality, the opposite of that is the scarcity mentality, which is, those people who see life as having only so much, pretty much one piece of the pie out there
Right.
is all we have
Right.
to choose from.
Yep. And he says abundance mentality is what flows out of a deep inner sense of personal worth and security.
Yeah.
So again, those habits of 1, 2, and 3 work towards putting you in abundance mentality mindset.
Right. And he reminds us that public victory does not mean victory over other people. It means success in effective interaction that brings mutual beneficial results. So don't confuse public victory with victory over other people. That's certainly not what he's meaning by that.
Yeah, I highlighted that one as well. That was good. A character rich in integrity, maturity, and the abundance mentality has a genuineness that goes far beyond technique or lack of it in human interaction.
Right.
So it really good character when it comes to interpersonal relationships. It's just genuine. It's real. It's truthful.
Right.
And it's believable. You know what I mean? No one's gonna think, oh, is he trying to be sneaky and like make me think that I'm winning or anything like that.
Right.
That's not what this is about. And actually coming from that place of a high character, it just comes off as genuine.
Right.
And you're not trying to fool anybody with anything.
Right. And it's out of that character, he says, from the foundation of character, we build and maintain win-win relationships. And that's why relationships is that next tier. And as you said before, the trust, the emotional bank account is the essence of win-win. And so that's how the emotional bank account feeds into this relationship.
And so moving into the relationship dimension here, you have, your emotional bank account, if that's high, credibility is no longer an issue, right? If our emotional bank account is high and I'm like, hey, Chris, here's what I think is a good idea for both of us. And I think this is how it will benefit both of us.
Right.
And you may not necessarily see that, but you can, if our emotional trust is high, then you can be like, you know what, I maybe not necessarily see it, but I trust you.
Right.
Maybe you're seeing something that I'm not seeing. Let's give it a go.
Yeah.
Right. And then that's basically what he's saying here with the relationship. And funny down here, he says, dealing with win-lose is the real test of win-win. Rarely is win-win easily achieved in any circumstance, but when the emotional bank account is low and people are in a lose or a win-lose mentality, it is hard to break that and turn it into win-win. But even in that, he says, relationship is still the key. You have to focus on the relationship. You have to focus on putting in deposits in their emotional bank account, not for manipulation, right? But just genuinely putting deposits into their emotional bank account to build trust, to build rapport, and then to be able to work towards and communicate a win-win scenario, basically.
Yeah. I love the beginning. If you're ready to move into the agreements, I just love the beginning of agreements, which says, "From relationships flow the agreements that give definition and direction to win-win." I love how he phrased that.
That's the key. So that's the roadmap to win-win is the agreement, basically.
Yeah.
The dimensions are the ingredients. The recipe book is basically the agreements, right?
Yes.
Did I say that right? I think I said that right. The dimensions are the ingredients to win-win.
Right.
That's it.
Yep.
I think I said agreements. The dimensions is the recipe, is the... I'm confusing my words here. Let's get back. The dimensions are the ingredients for win-win when the recipe is basically the agreements.
Yes.
There
Beautifully put.
I'm getting my analogy correct here.
You'll get it.
I don't want to mix up my analogy.
No, you
confuse
got it, man.
people. So here we are. We're on the right page now.
We are.
Agreements. And so basically here are the five parts of an agreement. One is desired results, right? Not methods. And that's the key distinction he makes here is that we're not looking for the same methods. That's not part of the win-win mentality. We really don't care about the methods as long as the result is what we're looking for, right? And that's what he did with his daughter and letting her use the car. That's what he did with his son and keeping the grass clean. Doesn't matter how many times per week that you use the car. It doesn't matter how many times per week that you clean the yard, that kind of thing.
Right.
As long as by the end of the week, all of our agreements are still met and the result is still the same.
Right.
guidelines, specific parameters, principles, policies, etc., that which in the results are to be accomplished. So there are your guardrails, right? That's what guardrails the whole process. Right. You know what I mean? You're not worried about the methods, but you still have a specific set of guidelines that you have to stick within, a certain set of parameters that you have to live within. Mm-hmm. 3 would be resources. Again, just the things available to you to help accomplish those results. Mm-hmm. 4, that's the one we missed. Accountability. Accountability is what we missed here. And that sets up the standards of performance and the time of evaluation. So you set up all that stuff, hey, we're gonna come back here, circle back around to this, make sure that we're both still on the same page Tuesday at 1:00 or, over the weekend, right. That type of thing. And know what we're looking for.
Yeah.
And then the last one, 5 here, is consequences, which is the good consequences and the bad consequences. Mm-hmm. The natural and logical ones, what will happen as a result of the evaluation. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so basically, you want to come up with an agreement with someone, and you want to come up with someone that you can clearly communicate a win-win scenario with. Go through each of these five things, and boom, you can come out with an agreement
just like
that fits both people. If you come and talk about it, communicate, your desires, nail down and agree, not just say this is what they are, but actually talk with the person and you both come to agreement that this is the desired result, this is the guidelines, this is the resources available, this is how the accountability is going to work, and these are the consequences, and you both agree on all of those things. That's how you get to win-win, basically.
Yeah.
Anything else you want to add to that?
I do not. You covered that pretty well, brother.
All right.
You got it, man.
So basically, he says these 5 elements give win-win agreements a life of their own. Mm-hmm. That's how these things come to life, really. And traditional authoritarian supervision is a win-lose paradigm. It's also a result of overdrawn emotional bank accounts. So again, just saying that, this is not what is common in a win-lose scenario. People don't go through these 5 elements of an agreement. It's the usual, the supervisor that say, do this, do that, right. Come on, And that's similar to that gopher mentality, that gopher delegation that we talked about a couple of chapters ago.
Yeah.
All right. So that pretty much covered that pretty well, I think. So we can just kind of go through the next few pages here, and I'm going to find something else that I that struck me. If you have anything else that is coming up, you can go ahead and.
Yeah, not in the agreements section. Did you want to stay in the agreement section?
No, I think I'm looking through here, and I think we pretty much covered it. Focus on the results, not the methods. We touched on that. Yeah, and just being clear about all those things. Mm-hmm. I guess the only last thing is that the consequences can be natural or logical result of performance rather than a reward or punishment that is arbitrarily handed out by the person in charge. So again, the consequences are also agreed upon, and they're not just punishments or rewards. Mm-hmm. It's just things that will happen. It's consequences. Mm-hmm. And so he says there are 4 kinds of consequences: financial, psychic, opportunity, and responsibility. And so, those are the kind of either negative consequences or positive consequences that can be, a result of the agreement and when it's evaluated. Mm-hmm. So anyway, moving on to systems.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so systems, he starts off by saying that a win-win can only survive in an organization when the system supports it. So it's all about what you talk versus what you reward. And and you gave that example of that company who rewarded only 40 people out of the 300 some. That if you talk win-win but you reward win-lose, then you got a losing program on your hand. I mean, it's really not going to work out. And then he says you basically get what you reward. If you want to achieve the goals and reflect the values in your mission statement, then you got to align those rewards with what you value. And so that's how the systems in place work for a win-win relationship.
Right. And that's when he goes into that example of the business that they, no doubt 40 people won at that annual meeting where they gave out awards and things like that, but everyone else lost, and so when they switched that around, is that almost, I guess, 800 of those who received the awards that year had produced as much per person in terms of volume and profit as the year's previous 40. Mm-hmm. The spirit of win-win had significantly increased the number of golden eggs and had fed the goose as well, releasing enormous human energy and talent. The resulting synergy was astounding to almost everyone involved.
Yes. And he points out the problem later in this section. He says, so often the problem is not in the system, so often the problem is in the system, not in the people. And so it's just as we mentioned before, just tweaking that system, that if you put good people in bad systems, you get bad results. But if you can have good people in good systems, then that's when it can really begin to grow.
Yep. And again, he says competition has its place, and it can have its place even in the marketplace or business setting, or against last year's performance, perhaps even against another office or individual where there's no particular interdependence, no need to cooperate. Right. So, I think that's interesting too. It can still be applied, that competition. Competition is a good thing, but it has to be dealt with in the right channels, the right energy. It can't be competition between people who are trying to cooperate with each other.
Right.
That's what leads to negative consequences.
Right.
And I like this thought here. For fixing the problem with a manager not being able to let his employees or the people he's managing fully take on their jobs and their responsibilities. He says the fix to that was we overlap the needs and goals of the managers with the needs and goals of the salespeople. And the need for human relations training suddenly disappeared. Yeah. So basically the problem with that situation was you had a manager that was actually financially rewarded from basically doing the job of the person that he was managing.
Right.
So it defeated the purpose of the person who was being managed to actually step up and do the job.
Right.
So then they made it financially plausible for the manager that his people, the people that he's managing, succeed. Though if those people succeeded, then that's where his financial benefit came from, not from just making the sale, specifically. Right. But if his salespeople made the sale,
right,
that's when. And so they lined up the goals and needs of the managers with the goals and needs of the salespeople.
Yeah.
And that's what clicked and made them work together in cooperation. And those people were able to step up in ways that they hadn't before.
Yes.
So then moving on to the last one here, the last dimension, which is processes. And basically here we have basically a 4-step process to actually to people who are seeking win-win solutions. So basically he gives a 4-step process here into integrating win-win solutions into a business relationship, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
First is to see the problem from the other point of view. Really seek to understand and give expression to the needs and concerns of the other party as well as or better than they can themselves. Again, just focusing on the character and relationship aspect, right? Just this is people and they have needs and wants too, just as much as you do.
Right.
Second, identify the key issues and concerns, not the positions involved, right? Third, determine what results would constitute a fully acceptable solution. And then fourth, identify possible new options to achieve those results.
Yes. And then he ends with reminding us of this, that win-win, it's not a personality technique. What we mentioned from the beginning, it's a total paradigm for human interaction. So it has to do with our interaction. It's not a technique. It's not about just you winning. It comes from a character of integrity and maturity, and the abundance mentality grows out of high trust relationships, kind of, again, repeating some of those dimensions that he began with.
Yep, exactly. And he continues on here, this paragraph. It is embodied in agreements that effectively clarify and manage expectations as well as accomplishments. It thrives in supportive systems, and it is achieved through the process we are now prepared to more fully examine in habits 5 and 6. So literally that whole paragraph, really it breaks down the whole chapter.
Yeah, it does.
In just those few words.
Right.
That is habit 4.
Yep.
Think win-win. Again, another powerful paradigm shift and another powerful idea to wrap our minds around and to integrate into our lives, and through applying that, there's a lot of cool things that I think can be done.
Well, really a really fantastic way to start off the public victories, getting out of the private. And then on the next episode, we get into habit 5, which again has an interesting title. I'm always taken by his titles of these habits, which the title for habit 5 is seek first to understand, then to be understood.
Yep.
It's going to be interesting.
Exactly. So that's next week. Looking forward to it.
Looking forward to it, man.
Yep.
I'll see you then.
All right.